So have you ever wanted to unleash your creativity and create a unique model that will turn heads? Maybe you want to improve an existing model to make it more in line with a lore or a story that you want to tell. Or that you just want to add some variety to your tabletop. Well, in that case, kitbashing a model might well be the solution for you. But how do you do it? Well, how to do that is exactly what we're going to look at today. I've been kitbashing and converting models for years, and I was thinking about how we actually do this. And what started this train of thought was Max from the Lizard of Doom channel. Now, he focuses largely on Games Workshop and Warhammer, and he was talking about what, if you could build any mini that Games Workshop has not built yet, then what would it be? Now, Max asked me to build something for that challenge, and while I do that, and whilst I was planning that, I thought it'd be a great opportunity to create a kind of a beginner's guide to converting or kit bashing unique models for yourself. So even if you have never done this before, I've got some great tips for you. Also, I'm going to challenge myself and push these foundational skills a step or two further and do something that I have never done before. Will it work? Well, you can let me know when we get to the end. Okay, so let's get started. Now, the principles we're going to go through today can be used in whatever genre you're modeling. It could be scale models or figures, both historical or fantasy or whatever. But for the challenge I've been given by Max, I'm going to focus on Warhammer 40,000. Now, I have loved the aesthetic of the Orks, especially the Beast Snagga range. But to me, the weirdboy psychers from Games Workshop have always seemed a bit too cartoony for the Beast Snaggas. Now, don't get me wrong, they're great sculpts, but they just don't do it for me. So let's see what we can do about that and make something unique. So first of all, what tools are you going to need? Now, in the previous video, I went through the basic equipment you need or to make your life a lot easier when it comes to kitbashing. But to make life easier, I'll put a full resource list down in the description. I'll also put some links in there so you can check them out for yourself, along with the up-to-date prices from retailers that I trust and use myself. For this model, I think I will use the body of an orc knob as a foundation. So tip number one is to start from a solid base, which means you can pick up and put the mini down easily and safely as you build your unique piece. Now, to make life easier, I tend to drill a small hole through the base of the foot up into the leg, which means I can put a tiny amount of super glue onto a bit of wire and pin it to the painting handle. This will make handling it before I base it a lot easier. Top tip number two is use the right pin in the right place. Now, what I mean by pinning is to use a small piece of wire or metal to form or reinforce a joint. Now, there are two ways you can do this. Now, the first is called a doweled joint, where you use the pin to reinforce a clean joint between two surfaces. This is exactly the same principle as the wooden pegs you use to reinforce a joint when you are putting flat pack furniture together. You may choose to do this if you have two pieces coming together that have a very small surface area, and using just glue, even super glue, may result in a weak joint that will break at a later date. Using a reinforcement pin or a dowel pin is simply a case of drilling a small hole in either piece and gluing a piece of wire into the hole and then gluing the other piece in place using a corresponding hole. This means that two pieces of plastic are glued together, but there is a solid core of metal between the two. Now, one extra little tip to get a good joint here is to glue it in place on one side and then dry fit it to make sure the two pieces come together completely. Now, if they don't, then you might need to trim off a little bit of the wire until you get a nice solid joint. Then when you're happy with it, you can then glue it in place. So make sure you dry fit it when you are putting the pins in to make sure the pin's not too long or too short. Now, the second type is what I call a posing pin. Now, if you look at this arm, it's not designed for this model, so it's never going to fit, especially in the position I want to have it. So instead, I'm going to drill through the model and glue a piece of wire in place. Then if I drill a hole in the arm, I can glue that in place to form a shoulder joint. Then I can ever so carefully bend the pin to put the arm in the position and the pose that I want. Now, the key thing here is to ensure that it looks natural. So ensure that the distance from the arm from the body looks right and is in a natural position. Now, if you're unsure, just move your own arm around to figure out the angles and things. Obviously, if there's a large gap, this is not only going to need filling, but I'll need to sculpt the missing anatomy, or cover it up with something else. Top tip number 3 is to look for shapes, not just components. So when you're sifting through your bits box, rather than looking for something that is exactly representing the thing you're trying to build, look creatively at the shapes you have and what you can turn them into. For example, Beast Snagga psychers are very happy to replace a body part bitten off by a large animal with a robotic prosthesis, even if it's a large part of their own head, yet they are more shamanistic than the general Ork weirdboys. So I want to mix the cyborg top half of this head I'm using with a large squig pelt draped over his head and shoulders. So looking through my bits box, I found an alternative head armour from the Age of Sigmar Gnashtooth model I did a while back. Now this will take a lot of cutting back and trimming to make it fit over the head, but I think it'll work. Now, okay, I think it's now time to break out the milliput. This is a 2-part putty which you mix in equal parts. Now using water will stop it from sticking to me and the sculpting tools, but it can make it rather sticky. So I find leaving it for about 5 to 20 minutes after mixing it up, then it starts to cure ever so slightly and makes it a lot easier to work. Now the image I have in my head for the final model means that I'll need to sculpt around the model and blend that into the base. This means that I will need to take the model off the pin and glue it onto its base. However, the base model is now easy to use with the painting handle anyway, so that's not going to be a problem. So for the squig pelt, I start with flattening the putty out and tearing off chunks. This means that the edges of the pelt will be nice and thin, and also tapered out, rather than a much thicker square edge cut. Then gently sticking that onto the model and blending that into the headpiece. And on that note, if you have ever enjoyed any of my videos, please could you do me a favour and hit the subscribe button. It helps this channel more than you know, and the bigger the channel gets, the more kit and equipment I can test, and more aspects of the modelling hobby can be explored. Right, let's carve up some plastic. Top tip number 4. I did say I had 3 earlier on, so I've got an extra. Basically, the top tip here is to keep it simple. Now, when kitbashing, it is really easy to get carried away and add tons of details to your model, which can make it cluttered and difficult to read. Sometimes less is more. On the flip side, if you need to push this rule to achieve the vision in your head, then you can use your paint scheme to help refine the focus a little bit. So in the spirit of that, I'm going to stretch this rule a little bit. Now, in my head at least, I have the image of this warp head summoning the War energy, which materialises into a ghostly squig, which he shoots forward into the enemy ranks. To try and sell that action, I want to pinch the idea of how you see magic in cartoons forming little vortexes, little tornadoes that snake and shoot around the character up towards the character's upstretched hand. Now, this idea may be completely stupid. Screw it, let's do it. So to create the vortex, I roll out a long, thin sausage of milliput and wind that around the figure and up to that outstretched hand. Well, I say outstretched hand. I thought I had one in my bits box from a previous project, but I can't find it anywhere. But as I want to have the ghostly squig kind of engulfing the end of the arm, you're not going to see it anyway. So now for the ghostly squig thingy. Now this is going to be back to the tip about looking for shapes rather than components. Now this bull skull from the top of an old banner will work well, and I found some horn spikes which I think came from an Age of Sigmar Ork Brute set. Now this should work well as a lower jaw, which I then embed into the putty. Then it's just a case of trying to sculpt the spell into shapes that indicate smoke, and using a sculpting tool to make the fur texture on the squig pelt before letting it dry overnight. Okay, that is all dry, and I've primed the whole thing in Tamiya Grey Surface Primer. So now it's time to play with some paint. So to help pick up the details as well as to add some pre-shading, I coat the whole thing in Tamiya Sea Blue before a zenithal highlight of Tamiya Deck Tan. Okay, to start painting the orc skin. Now I could just paint it green, but ever since I painted the train troll from the Blood Bowl, I personally really like blending from a pinky tan colour through to dark green. Now if you want to see how I do this in more detail, then I'll put a link to that train troll painting video down in the description, so you can check that out later if you like. Now between you and me, at the moment at least, I'm really enjoying painting green orc skin using the colours within the World War II US Army Soldier Uniform Colour Set by AK Interactive, and also mixing in Tamiya Deck Tan for the lightest parts and the Vallejo Sky Blue mixed into the green for the deepest shadows in the skin. The colours within that set just seem to transition really nicely. For the squig pelt, I want to try a more reddy brown to contrast with the green, but then blend that out into a tan colour. Now, my logic is that the tan colour will help frame the model a bit and help define the shapes. Okay, so on to the ghostly squig effect. So for the effect I'm going for here is a glowing smoke effect. This is really pushing the envelope for me, as I have never done this before. I know the theory, but never tried it. So let's see how it goes. Okay, so I have some fluorescent red from Vallejo, which I've not used much up until now, but could work really nicely as a glow effect, and also contrast with the green of the Ork. But painting smoke in general, let alone glowing smoke, is tricky, as smoke is not solid. So we are painting a solid 3D non-transparent model and try and make it look like semi-transparent smoke. So the first step is to lay the deep shadow, or what would be the darkest, most dense part of the smoke. So rather than black, it's a lot more interesting to add colour to it that will contrast and also make the red glow effect pop more. So I'm going to make a mix of dark green, which will contrast against the red, and mix that dark green with a black to make a very dark green, and lay that down as a base layer. Then adding a little Tamiya deck tan to the mix and try and build up the volumes, layering each lighter colour with the previous one, using smaller and smaller amounts with the brightest highlights at the upper edges of each volume. Now the theory is that the upper volumes of the smoke will be thinner, and therefore they will let through more light, whereas the core of the smoke will be denser and darker. Then when I'm happy with the light values, then I try and bring together those layers, bring them together with some glazes. Now if you're looking for a straight smoke effect, you could leave it just there, but I want to risk it for a biscuit and try and create a deep glowing effect deep within the smoke. So the next phase is completely counterintuitive. I'm going to take an ivory colour and outline the darkest folds of the smoke, right in the crease where the shadow of the volume starts, and feather that in slightly. The goal is to set the hottest, deepest glow, so I'll look for the glow is coming from inside the smoke rather than sitting on top of it, if that makes sense. Now, this will look absolutely horrible to start off with, but we need to trust the process. Next we take that fluorescent colour and paint it over the ivory we just laid down. Now this fluorescent paint is really, really thin, so it acts more like a filter rather than a solid colour. The ivory will make the colour pop, yet where it goes over the dark green, it will tint it slightly, but a lot more subtly. Then you can punch that glow up a bit further by highlighting the red glow again in a smaller amount on that brighter highlights, then going over the ivory again with the layer of fluorescent paint, and repeating this smaller and smaller and smaller steps until you get that nice bright element right at the very peak. Now one thing I have to stress here is that this is not a recipe. It is not a 1-step, 2-step, 3-step process. Your brain will have a lot of preconceived ideas of how it should look. But then as you look at it, you will realise and recognise certain bits that are off. So you'll need to keep going back and forth, building a highlight here, increasing a shadow there, adding a glaze over both, if you see what I mean. Being honest, this stage took me absolutely ages, but by the end of it, that's something that I was fairly pleased with. Now looking at it, it does look like the heat is coming from within the smoke. I also really like the effect as it comes through the sound effect paint, so it looks like the power is coming out of the earth. But while it does contrast nicely with the green skin, but when you view it from above, which it will be on the tabletop, there is already a lot of reds and yellows in the squig hide, as well as a sandy base. So there is less contrast than I was initially expecting, which is an interesting point. Also, it looks more like a hot magma weapon rather than a ghostly apparition. On reflection, maybe a green glow might have been better to contrast against the pelt and the sand. What do you think? Now, I did ask some of my friends about this. I even asked the dogs. And yet I still spent an entire day just staring at this thing, changing my mind every 5 minutes. But, okay, decision made. I've decided to go with the green. Is it the right call? Well, you can be the judge at the end of the video. So as I'm going for a green glow this time, I use a dark purple as the dark base colour to contrast with the green, before building up the volumes through layering and glazing exactly like I did the first time. And then adding the ivory colour into the base and to create those peak highlights. But this time I don't have any fluorescent green. So I'm going to use instead this very bright green from Army Painter, but add highlights of mixing scale 75 high key yellow and then building that up using more and more yellow until the brightest highlights are basically pure high key yellow. Now I did have to thin this down quite a lot to make it much more like a glaze, like a wash, because the standard paint is far too thick just to apply it straight on. Now once again, this took an absolute age of going back and forth to get it where I wanted. Also, another thing I learned while doing this links back to that previous tip about keeping it simple. With everything going on, it was a really busy model to look at. So rather than the added chipping around the mask and metallics around the helmet, I simplified it right down to a dark colour around the whole thing, so painting the helmet black, putting a glow effect across the eyes, the eye slit, and also with some simple edge highlights, and darkening the body down, which made it a lot easier to read, I think. So there you go, one complete, unique, mini made-up parts from about 6 different kits from Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 40k kits, and a chunk of milliput thrown in for good measure. So let your creativity go, make something awesomely unique. Also push your boundaries, try something new. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. That is all part of the modelling journey. On that note, which version do you prefer? Do you prefer the green effect or the red effect? Now if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and let me know your favourite bits down in the comments. I'd love to hear what you're working on as well. Also, if you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe button. It really helps out channels like this more than you know. And I'll see you on the next project.